Alright, so back with another Spotlight with Context. This time we are looking over the long-awaited, much-memed Morbius. We're going to skip right ahead over his base stats and abilities. There's nothing all that special here. His prestige, I think, puts him around 50th, kind of in the same realm as Professor X. It's not the worst if you take him up, especially as a high Sig 7-star or something, but it's not special. Moving on to his attributes, survivability at 4.5 is absolutely accurate, especially if you run the recoil masteries and have him awakened. There are a lot of sources of regen and damage mitigation in this kit. Damage 4.5 is definitely there. This does rely on you getting your debuffs to stick on the opponent and on them not having damage caps, but with those two small caveats, he's a pretty solid nuke. Ease of use 3.5, I think, is also pretty accurate. The baseline playing of Morbius is just dead simple. You basically just go special 1, special 2, combos in between, your opponent's probably dead. There's nuance, there's skill expression above that with really figuring out how to use the Psionic Glide properly, but the basics are very simple. Utility at 3.5, this is mostly hanging on the power of that Psionic Glide and his ability to control regen rate and ability power. We'll go over the nuances of that, but there's quite a bit there, as you might expect from a science champion. And then Defender Strength 2, not really a whole lot going on here. He goes unblockable. If you can avoid that, there's not much else. If you get hit by that, it hurts. Pretty simple. Alright, looking at strengths. We have a burst damage, but I will call out that this is kind of the old definition of burst damage, as in this is a character that can burst you down quickly. This does not mean a character that deals burst damage. Morbius kind of packs everything he's got into a single giant yellow number, and so that is what's referred to as the burst. Like we already talked about, very tanky, multiple sources of regen, great at controlling regen, at ability power, even some light heal reversal, and good against mystics who mess with his buffs, right? Nullify, stagger, neutralize, all of those can make him actually stronger. And then weak to Purify, because he's a science champion who likes his buffs, or his debuffs to stick on the opponent. Weak to his own regen rate being reduced, and I'll also call out the flip side of the earlier focus on a single big hit, means that damage caps really, really hurt this guy. So, getting into the abilities themselves, the most dynamic part of the kit is definitely the Psionic Glide. Like it says, you get this by dashing forward from outside of striking distance, which is basically the same as how Kitty Pryde's dashing phase works. You have to be far enough away to actually dash, not just perform a medium to get this part, or dash forward during the opponent's special attack. This is a separate condition, meaning that you don't have to be as far away during a special attack. You just have to perform that medium and start moving forward, and that is going to allow you to position yourself really carefully at the end of a special attack, cause the final hits to miss you, and just turn on that glide whenever you want it, as long as you're using it to deal with a special. Very powerful ability, generally better against mystics because they throw more specials. Not much more to be said there. So, Psionic Glide itself, why you care about it, on top of that miss for incoming attacks, is that it cannot be blocked, which also means you don't have to worry about parries, which is important when you're doing, dashing forward mechanics. And it gains extra attack rating. That's always nice, does one big hit. You also get a bleed debuff. It does basically no damage, but it lasts 24 seconds, and that's going to be a theme you're going to see throughout. Morbius is not about doing a lot of bleed damage to the opponent. That's more of a skill champion thing. That's more of like a blade thing. Morbius just cares that the opponent is bleeding. That was the angle the designer decided to take for the living vampire thing, and you'll see quite a bit of that. So this can also be inflicted through block, And if your opponent is recovering from a special attack, like say if you use the Psionic Glide to cause the last bit of their special to miss, you get 4 bleeds instead of 1, significantly improving your ramp. So after the Psionic Glide is done, you get a 100% fervor buff, which is going to make all of your damaging effects 100% more likely to proc non-flat, meaning that whatever the listed chance is, double that. Don't add 100 to it, right? And that'll last 10 seconds. While it's active, Morbius can't perform a glide again. But if the fervor buff is nullified or fails due to ability accuracy reduction, like if Morbius is neutralized, well then you get a non-stacking passive instead, which does not stop the glide, meaning you can keep going for it. This also says that if the passive itself fails, it'll try to reapply after 1.5 seconds. So a bit of a cooldown, but Morbius is going to try and get that fervor effect one way or another. So I already said, in general, Morbius's bleeds don't really serve the purpose of doing damage to the opponent. It's just that when his opponent is bleeding, he himself gets much stronger. So you see that right here, 20% chance on any basic hit to inflict a bleed, doing basically no damage over 24 seconds. And each damaging debuff on the opponent lowers regen rate by 10% and ability power rate by 5%, up to a maximum benefit at 10 debuffs. This means you have a ceiling so far of 100% regen rate reduction, 50% ability power rate, right? Now, Morbius does not benefit from the Despair Mastery, so you don't also tack another 100% onto that regen rate reduction, but instead, as long as there's at least one damaging debuff, including your bleeds on the opponent, then their regen and ability power rate goes down by another 5% for each rank. This means if you're running Max Despair, like many of us do, then your new cumulative ceilings are 115% regen rate reduction, which is going to counter the 3 points in recovery most people run and actually zero out regen. And ability power rate is going to go up to a ceiling of 65%. So you're cutting things like Mystic Dispersion down by 2/3. Now, on top of that, when the opponent is suffering from 10 or more damaging debuffs, which is what you're going to be aiming for to get your ceiling of 10 debuffs anyway, right? You also inflict a non-stacking 25% Petrify debuff. Reminder, Petrify also reduces regen rate and ability power rate, so now your ceilings are 140% regen rate reduction and 80% ability power rate reduction. That 80% is very powerful. It's not going to completely stop Mystic Dispersion. It's not going to completely stop other power gain abilities, but it heavily blunts them, right? Additionally, that 140% regen rate reduction means you are now reversing healing. And so against certain opponents, that starts getting very strong. Now, this Petrify lasts 10 seconds, technically, but it's paused indefinitely as long as the opponent has 10 or more damaging debuffs, so it starts paused, because it only triggers in the first place when you're already there. When you consume those debuffs, or they fall off or are purified, then the Petrify starts ticking down. And then while the opponent is petrified, Morbius himself is going to gain power from hitting the opponent or being hit more quickly, plus 1% extra combat power rate for each damaging debuff on the opponent. So the special attack 1 is basically just a ramp special. Each hit has a 50% chance to inflict a bleed debuff, which means when your fervor buff or passive is active, that's going to be a 100% chance on every hit. Same bleeds as before. And personal fervor buffs are paused during this attack, so you get the benefit through the whole thing, but then expire immediately when it's complete, which means that if you use this attack to push your opponent over a bar of power, and then they stand up and throw a special, you will have your Psionic Glide on cooldown to deal with it appropriately. This is probably the biggest part of Morbius's skill expression, is learning how to weave the Special 1 and the Psionic Glide together for that kind of moment. But once you have enough bleeds on the opponent, which you're just going to get from doing your psionic glides, from landing your basic combos and your special ones. You're going to want to go for your special 2, which is going to be easier when you have a lot of bleeds because you get extra combat power, right? Now, the special 2 pauses personal damaging debuffs during it, which just means you don't have to worry about them falling off during the attack and making what you thought was a great cash out a mediocre one, right? If the opponent is petrified, then the second hit, which is the bite, becomes a guaranteed crit, consumes all damaging debuffs, and increases attack rating by a big chunk for each one, up to a maximum benefit at 40. This is the giant yellow number that you saw in Deep Dive. And of course, because this consumes all damaging debuffs on the opponent, like we talked about earlier, after this, your Petrify will start ticking down, but you can pause it again if you stack bleeds back up quickly enough. Nice little benefit there. So this attack is also going to passively regen up to 15% of damage dealt by that giant crit, up to 10% of your max health. It's actually going to regen it even if it's not a guaranteed crit, but you're probably throwing this when it is, right? And so this can be a pretty chunky amount of lifesteal. Throwing a special getting 10% back can top you up in battlegrounds and help you close out a fight. You can do this a few times in longer content. This is really powerful, right? Now the special 3 is very similar to the special 2, except for the price of that extra bar of power and waiting through the longer animation, you don't consume the debuffs. You don't lose your Petrify, but you get the same attack boost, and you get the same regen, right? Now, the other downside of the Special 3, potentially, is that Special 3s cannot crit, and so if you were relying on that crit to get through your opponent's resistances or armor, then the Special 3 won't look nearly as good as the Special 2, but because it keeps you ramped, it's a very powerful tool, especially in those longer fights. Now, another thing I want to talk about before we get to the signature ability is Deep Wounds on Morbius, because I've already had several people ask me, does he need Deep Wounds? How important is Deep Wounds for him? Well, we saw all of his bleeds last 24 seconds, right? Deep Wounds at max rank gives 2.5 seconds to bleeds. So you're getting an extra 10%, right? That is going to make it that much easier to stack up bleeds. But another way to look at this is that with your Fervor buff, you have a 40% chance on each basic to apply a bleed, right? Meaning that in a 5-hit combo, you're probably going to apply 2. A 5-hit combo takes almost 2.5 seconds, which means that Deep Wounds is probably going to just let you fit in one more combo in your ramp before your Special 2 cash out. That is good, right? It's probably going to get you 2 more bleeds. It's going to get you about 3,000 more attack on those big specials. But that's not critical, right? Odds are, a lot of the times, you're still going to take out an opponent that you should be fighting with that big hit without those last 2 bleeds. Now, the thing that, I'm going to give credit to MP Blaze for mentioning this, the thing that Deep Wounds is probably more likely to benefit Morbius with is after that big Special 2 or Special 3, when you've done all that damage to your opponent, then you probably have more health than your opponent, and the second clause of Deep Wounds is going to come into play, and you're going to start chunking off their health in percentages. That can be a really efficient way to close out a fight quickly if you're already close to it, and so there is real benefit. But at the same time, if you haven't invested in Deep Wounds yet, for one thing, you probably should, but this isn't necessarily the character that's going to do that for you. He's not anywhere near as important, or it's not anywhere near as important for him as it is for much of the skill class or somebody like Nick Fury, right? So, moving on to the signature ability, when the opponent is immune to bleed, personal bleeds, you get up to a 100% chance to inflict rupture debuffs instead, which of course deal physical damage instead of direct, and copy the bleed's behavior. Meaning, they scale everything in the kit, right? They still reduce the ability power rate, they still scale or they still reduce the opponent's regen rate. They have all of those effects, but they're no longer direct damage, and it's also important to note they don't get the benefit from deep wounds. So you're paying a bit of a price for using a vampire against someone who can't bleed. Shocker. But you still have that flexibility if you need to fight somebody like, say, Man-Thing. With Morbius, as long as you have him at high sig, you can do it, right? The dev notes on this one are also interesting and point out that because this is just a chance to apply a rupture when a bleed fails, it doesn't care about the chance of the original bleed to apply. That check has already been passed. And so if you have a fervor effect active when you go to apply these bleeds, the fervor will help the ruptures. And so getting this ability to a high enough sig level to get even a 50% chance for these ruptures, if you play Morbius properly and keep uptime on that fervor buff or passive, then this can actually feel more like 100% significantly sooner. So there's some room for skill expression in there, and you may not necessarily need him at max sig even for the flexibility. But the main reason a lot of people are going to want the sig is because of this second bullet point. When taking direct damage from any source, meaning degen, nodes like brute force, or just bleed or the poison from the liquid courage mastery, there's the big ticket item, gain a non-stacking undying passive that falls off after not taking direct damage for 2 seconds and then goes on cooldown. So this means if you're just taking like bursts of direct damage, then this is maybe not going to save you because you're going to take the burst, it's going to expire, and then it's going to go on cooldown, and then the next one can potentially kill you, right? But as long as there's consistent sources of direct damage, then you keep this Undying passive the whole time, and the Undying passive is going to keep you from being knocked out by direct damage, but also by energy or physical damaging effects. So it's very, very strong in that way. It kind of turns Morbius into Corvus Glaive. And while this is active, you are also going to regen a percentage of the direct damage taken. This scales with sig level, but it can be quite a bit, right? Like if you are running Liquid Courage with Morbius, then you are getting the willpower healing from having the poison on you, and you are also attempting to regen half of that incoming damage on top of that. It'll get reduced a bit because poison reduces regen rate, but this can be a just constant source of healing during the fight and make Morbius very, very hard to kill. Against skill champions, this regen is half as strong, so it's not going to be as busted, but it's still very, very good. Now, we do have to talk about this. This is not an immortality effect, right? This is not Hercules. Even a single blocked hit can knock Morbius out once he gets down here. It's not something that you necessarily want to rely on keeping you alive at all times, but it is very, very good for keeping death at bay just long enough to close out the fight, to get a special 2 or a special 3 off and get your regen in, something along those lines, right? It's still very, very good. And then moving on to synergies, these are pretty simple, but with the Legion of Monsters, everyone except Punisher gets a Torment passive for 30 seconds, meaning that out of the gate their damaging debuffs last longer. That can be pretty solid for a number of these, but especially Werewolf and Elsa, because they're pretty solid at blitzing down opponents. And Punisher is going to get that Torment after he resists a lethal blow and uses his Sig ability, right? With Blade specifically, Morbius gets the ability to apply bleeds on parries. They only last 10 seconds, so for this synergy, Deep Wounds is actually going to be better than it is for Morbius's base kit, but this is going to allow you to ramp that much faster, right? This is also probably pretty helpful if you are in a matchup that is making it difficult to use your Psionic Glide for some reason or another. And then Blade, for his part, will reduce the opponent's ability power rate by 5% per damaging debuff on the opponent. up to 10, meaning that if he's keeping a lot of bleeds on the opponent, he can cut their ability power by up to half. This can be really nice against somebody like Mephisto, who generally them gaining power is the one threat Blade really has to deal with. With Punisher again, and also Mole Man, all of the Synergy members are going to get extra bleed debuff duration. This 10% is about the same impact as max deep wounds for Morbius, so that's pretty strong. Mole Man has a lot of bleed damage. It can just kind of up his damage output by nearly 10% in Frenzy. And then Punisher, for his part, is going to get a regen passive, so on top of that Torment effect earlier, he's also going to be able to get some health back, potentially for the next fight. And then with Carnage, Venom, Misty Knight, and Iron Fist, you just get some extra critical rating, right? And that is Morbius. If you run Recoil on a regular basis, you are probably going to be extremely happy with a duped Morbius, but you don't need Recoil for him to be good. Even without that, Undying is a very potent ability that can deal with a lot of dangerous opponents. Power Stings also do direct damage, an important caveat. It can help keep you alive against some dangerous quest nodes, including ones in endgame content like Eternity of Pain. And Morbius just deals a lot of damage and can heal, right? Like, this is a very strong champion. It's pretty easy to play. I imagine a lot of people are going to want him. A lot of people are going to get him via the Platinum Pass, but even if you did not go in for that, keep an eye out for him when he enters more conventional acquisition methods. Hope you found this interesting. Let me know with any further comments or questions in the comments. And until next time, thanks so much for watching, and take care.